We're in a time of shift and agility, and I think that's a good thing. We need to be more attuned to being neighbors rather than just serving neighbors.
One of the things that really defines this community is how much the people within it want to care for each other and for the neighborhood around them, and really the global community as well.
It's really exciting because we feel like we're kind of creating a new model.
When I was first called to St. Paul's Lutheran Church, I had been a pastor for about 3.5 years. It was a little urban church on the corner of Lowry and Quincy Avenue, not far from here. And it, like many urban congregations, was struggling in some ways to kind of connect with its changed community around it. They were sensing a call to want to reconnect with their neighbors who had moved in. And so we started doing that, and a lot of that was through relationship building. At that time also, we engaged in conversation with 2 other Lutheran churches that were both within less than a mile from us, who were in similar situations, kind of trying to figure out what God had in mind for them as well. The 3 churches that came together and went through this exploration and discernment process were St. Paul's Lutheran that I was serving, Emmanuel Lutheran, which was right across the street from Logan Park in northeast Minneapolis, and then Holy Triune Lutheran, which was in the Wyndham Park neighborhood. We had some similarities, but also some differences. One of the churches was primarily comprised of membership that were 70 and older, and they really were disconnected from the neighborhood, and they felt like they wanted to get reconnected, but really didn't know how. And they tried some of the classic things that churches do, door knocking or having outdoor worship or, having an outdoor meal or whatever. And when it didn't happen, then they would get discouraged and think, well, people just aren't interested, or they just don't want to go to church, or don't believe in God, or that kind of thing. The other church, Emmanuel, had this enormous building, which is the one we initially settled in, that actually became their mission and ministry, just trying to keep that building going. And so they were saddled with all of the expenses of what was a 27,000 square foot building. The church I was serving, St. Paul's, was the smallest of the 3 buildings. It was in really good shape. There was some vitality in the membership, but not a sense that we had enough of what it would take to really engage the communities. And there was some tension around how we might go about it, or is God really calling us to work together to do it? There was some concern, particularly among older or longtime members, that they were getting left out in the shuffle here, that we were so focused on wanting to reach the neighborhood and connect with the neighborhood that we would forget about their needs, the quilters and others who gathered for circles and that kind of thing. And so we really had to be thoughtful and intentional about how we talked about we're going to keep doing those kinds of ministries, but we also want to respond to God's call to reach out to our neighbors, to share the love of Christ beyond the walls. So each of the 3 churches formed what was called the Joint Exploration Team, or JET was our little acronym. We appointed 3 members from each church to go through a process of looking at what ministries we were currently doing at that time, what ministries we felt called to do and didn't feel called to do. And through that process of kind of joint discernment, we came up with what we thought was a good plan for the establishment of a new church. And we really kind of came around to 4 priorities as I remember it. One was to better serve children and families in our neighborhood. Another was to improve our worship life. A third was to improve our pastoral care to the community and to our own community, faith community. And then the 4th was to develop a facility that would be honoring of God and serve the congregation and the community for years to come.
Grace Center for Community Life is a really great resource for our neighborhood. I think it's an amazing place not only to come together for Grace Lutheran Church that resides here in the building, but also there's a school, New City School, the food shelf is in here. We all collaborate in many ways. Definitely our building is unique in that it used to be Holland Elementary School. It has kind of been renovated and repurposed into a community gathering place. I mean, people are invited to also come here and host events or have meetings, different things. And there have been a lot of really great organizations that have done things in here and continue to.
The building functions as a community hub in a lot of ways, and that's the long-term desire, is to continue developing that, right? Obviously, we have tenants like the charter school. We also have people that use our full commercial kitchen. So different caterers or different companies that are just sort of starting to get off the ground. We've had food trucks that use it as their prep kitchens. They can bring their truck in so easily into our large back parking lot, load up right out the door. We even have an outdoor cooler for them to store their food, which then again means we're bringing in all of these great resources and making community connections. We're able to provide a space at really equitable market rates, and then also be able to benefit from that. We've had sometimes their excess food will then flow into our food shelf.
For those who are in kind of mission developer mode or in starting new church mode, one of the first things you're often told is, don't buy a building, because that'll just be a saddle on your back and you'll have to put all your time and attention into that. So what did we do? We bought a building, but what we did was fairly unique. We set up a separate new nonprofit corporation to own and manage the building, and also be an organization that could possibly provide services to the community that aren't currently here. And that idea helped us to get in contact with people who would have expertise in areas that we would need help with, like property management, maybe the provision of services, fundraising, construction, all these kinds of things. One of the other important aspects of forming an organization to take on the building, so to speak, is that would hopefully free up the church to just focus on its mission, and the pastor of the church to just focus on ministry and not having to be a property manager himself or herself.
As far as physical needs, there's not a lot of prep, unfortunately, in seminary for how to deal with a building's physical needs. And of course, part of that is that we are all scattered out into the four winds of every different kind of building, right? Some of us are renters, some of us are owners of long-term buildings, some of us are paying off mortgages, some of us go into buildings that have just been redone. One of the great things that Pastor Craig did was in creating Grace Center for Community Life and Grace Lutheran, and then also finding a way to separate the leadership of those two, so that our building director, who's currently Lori Strom, can do the work of tenant relations, rent collection, coordinating building upkeep, while I get to be the pastor of the community. So many pastors, especially pastors of older buildings, have to be both pastor and some form of landlord, and it's a huge burden. And so especially for a church that's smaller with a solo pastor, to be able to say, I don't have those burdens on my time and energy, is a huge gift.
There were some hiccups along the way, but we continued to work through those. And if I were to suggest this kind of process for another church, I would say you have to be, again, flexible and agile. Because you can set it all out on paper and it looks great, but then there's all of the relational aspects of it. You put people into the org charts, and then you have to start to live it out. So, and to not be afraid of that, I think, and to realize that everybody hopefully has the same intentions as you're moving through it, and are working in good faith to make it work as best as possible. Another aspect of the discernment that we went through when looking at the possibility of joining our ministries together was these church buildings that we had. And in our case, we happened to have sort of a small, medium, and large assortment of buildings, each of which the congregations that worshiped there and called them home had deep attachments to. They had lifelong memories, some of the folks who'd been around, those churches their whole lives. And we always say, or often say, the church is not the building, it's the people, and that is true. But those are sacred spaces, so I think that's a little too dismissive to just say they're not important, because they are. They're the place where holy events happen, and so we tried to be as respectful as we could in talking about those things, and pointing toward the fact that those memories can still be held on to, but that new memories can start to take place in new spaces, and we create the meaning, we create the symbols, along with the enduring symbols of the cross. So then we decided we would sell the 2 other church buildings so that we can start to form a new story. And so there's that tension again of how do we both honor memory and tradition, but also create new story and new traditions. So part of the wondering was, where do we worship inside of a school building? And it's about as utilitarian a building as you could get. But remarkably, there's this space in the middle that had this open atrium area. It was designed to be like an indoor playground when it was built in the 60s. And it had skylights in it, but the skylights had been covered over essentially by a roof going from the first to the second floor. So it was barely visible on the inside. But that led us to thinking, what if we had a sanctuary space right in the middle of this building and could make a renovation work so that everything going on around it would be centered on the sanctuary and on the center of grace, which it ultimately came to be called. The process even that we went through to repurpose the parking lot out there was over an acre of asphalt that we were able to pull up and put in green space through a generous grant from the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization, inviting people to gather outdoors. But all of it was to hopefully serve the purpose of making this a gathering place for the community. As a church, we certainly wanted to also share the love of Christ, and we thought that one way to do that was to make this space available. And we also loved the idea that we would have a building that would be active every day of the week with different kinds of things going on. And as you can hear in the background, possibly, there's a lot of activity going on right now in the middle of the day.
All of that is work that Pastor Craig and other pastors that came before me did so beautifully and so well. So what that got us to then in April 2016 was a church that is ready to engage with the neighborhood, that is freed from concerns about building maintenance because we share those concerns and needs with other building tenants. Grace Lutheran was interestingly situated in that way because we've already begun to disentangle from understanding a community is defined by a building, which is that's not unique to Christianity, is it, or unique to a religious institution. We all think of ourselves as defined by the buildings that we come from. So how do we work through the grief over losing a building, especially when we might have invested time and energy into stepping into what can newly be done?
Little Kitchen Food Shelf was started by Grace Lutheran Church. We have been doing a lot of really interesting things here that I think are really different from most other food shelves in the area.
We've engaged with a lot of different programs that help bring in foods that would be not only healthy, but also meet the needs and nutritional expectations of the clients of the food shelf. So we try to think through, what are the ethnic communities that people are coming from, and would they feel comfortable cooking what they get at the food shelf?
One thing that right away sets us apart is we are a no restrictions, no boundaries food shelf. Most food shelves, there are certain zip code address requirements. There's also income requirements, but here we serve everyone. So that is really helpful for people who are homeless, new immigrants who have come into the city. There are just a lot of people who can't even use certain food shelves because of that. All people deserve equal access to fresh, healthy ingredients and foods and produce, and that is at the forefront of our minds too. And to that end, we have Grace Gardens, and we grow fresh vegetables and everything every summer. We also partner with Eastside Food Co-op, and that provides us with a lot of organic ingredients and items too. It's really exciting because we feel like we're kind of creating a new model for what a food shelf can be. It can be more than just simply waiting for people to come to you.
Another way that I've seen this church participate in long-term reforms towards justice, long-term participation in the coming kingdom of God, is in its expansive welcome and outreach to the LGBTQ+ community. 3 years ago, we started an organization or a sort of outreach community called the Queer Grace Community, which is specifically a worship and Bible study and fellowship designed program for members of the LGBTQ+ community and our allies.
I think it probably comes as no surprise to anyone who has friends or family members that are a part of the queer and trans communities, that church has not been typically a place where they felt welcome. And even for those of us who have grown up or experienced churches that are welcoming, the space in which we're welcomed is not a space that feels queer. It's not a space that feels trans. It feels like a place where oftentimes, at best, oftentimes we're tolerated and at best welcomed into someone else's community.
It's long been my conviction that the LGBTQ community does not just need affirmation from the Christian church in order to grow and flourish. We have a lot of other spiritual needs. And in addition, we bring incredible spiritual gifts. Sometimes by just who we are as individuals, and sometimes by how we've been formed as the queer and trans community and what we can bring out of that understanding. Sometimes more nuanced understandings of oppression and justice. Sometimes a more expansive understanding of who God is and how God acts in the world, because we've been freed from perhaps patriarchal and gender normative understandings of the way that the world is formed. And what I've been deeply, deeply fulfilled to see happen at Grace Lutheran is the truth of that, of both how welcoming in people who have been pushed out and people who have had different experiences but still come with incredible spiritual gifts can nourish the whole community. And it's just a time for us to socialize and hang out with each other in a space that is specifically for queer and trans Christians and our allies, and be able to just connect with each other.
Things like pronouns, gender identities, sexual identities are both recognized and celebrated. There's no questions or assumptions about the people who walk in our doors. That as much of a home as queer spaces like queer bars have been to queer communities, we wanted this space to be a home for people who are existing at the edge of both queer identities and Christian identities. Creating a space that is not just welcoming and not just tolerating of queer and trans identities, but where queer and trans identities are central. We do game nights, and then in addition to that, we usually once a month have a Bible study that Emmy leads. When there are like queer trans related movies coming out, we'll host an event to go see those movies and then host a happy hour discussion after the movie. We hosted a sexual health fair, essentially. We had organizations for STI testing, HIV testing, queer adoption agencies. Once a quarter, we host a queer clothing exchange. We don't have some agenda that's driving us forward for the next 10 years. We're a community of people who care about each other. The thing that makes QGC is the people who care about it and the people who care about the people who come there.
That was one of the most beautiful things for me, was when I was in a conversation with an older member who was struggling because somebody was transitioning and would change names every now and then depending on where their comfort level was that day. And she remarked to me, "I just can't always remember their name." And then she paused and said, "But I can always ask them to sit with me at coffee hour." And that was the moment for me of understanding we might not all be in the same place politically, theologically, just understanding our paradigms of the world. But we maybe have created a place where even if we don't remember exactly how to address each other when we're apart, we can still be practicing a better relationship together. That I see so much looks like the kingdom of God.
I look at what's happening now at Grace Lutheran Church and at Grace Center for Community Life and realize that was a good time for me to leave. I think it was time for a new season of leadership. And just to see how the congregation is thriving now in some of the same ways and in some new ways. Pastor Emmy is just doing, I think, incredible ministry in the community and with LGBTQ folks who we had always wanted to connect more with, and now that's a thriving ministry. To see the continuation of some of the plans we had put in place for Grace Center in terms of renovations and sort of building up its capacity to serve the neighborhood is incredibly gratifying.
There has been such great work done to get to the point of where we were at in April 2016 that I benefited from so much, from Pastor Craig's leadership, from the many other pastors that came before me, to cultivate this community into a really radical new understanding of what a church building is for and what the church community is meant to do. But I think one of the things that's defined this community and helped it adapt is that we've shed our expectations about church as solely defined by a building and church as solely defined by the pastor. I believe that what it means to be the church is that the people are the church.
A lot of it is even just having the imagination and the courage and the flexibility to think about what could be, how we could do church differently, how we could be church differently. And once you allow yourself to start going down that road, it starts to open up pathways that may not have been there before. And I think that's the exciting part of what I do now, is to see light bulbs go on when people say, you know, I don't know that we'd ever thought of that before, or we hadn't allowed ourselves to think about that before. But it frees us up to think more about how is God already working in the world and how do we respond to that or move with that. And there's no going back in terms of just being able to fall back on familiar processes and routines.